When I was small, my mom used to tell her friends that I was a strong-willed child, and that was not a compliment. When I was 15 and super stylish, my principal of my Christian high school called me a witch because he believed I had the makings of a rebel, as you can clearly see. And then not so long ago at work, I was voted most likely to say fuck in front of an executive, and I did. So you might think, based on that short resume, that I am really comfortable speaking my mind, but you would be wrong. Because I grew up in the middle of the United States in a very small farming town where everyone voted and still votes quite conservatively. They eat a lot of sweet corn. They go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday night. And church had a lot to say about what I could say and do and wear and think. In that fundamentalist world, women are submissive and silent. They're allowed to play the piano, but not stand in the pulpit. They're taught to be keepers at home and subservient to their husbands. They are quite literally not allowed to wear the pants. These are my super adorable parents, Dave and Sue. As you might guess from their sweet faces, they're really great people. I had a good childhood and they loved me really well. But my dad also made it very clear to me that as my father, it was his job to protect me. And when I was old enough to be married, then he would hand me over to my husband, who would then take over the job of protecting me, and there would be no in between. So he wanted to make sure I had a good life, but in his worldview, the man is the head of the household, which meant that my mother, who is a strong person in her own right, deferred to my father in all decision making. And when I was a teenager and wanted to go on a date with a boy, that boy had to be interviewed by my father and get his approval before we were allowed to see each other. So as you can imagine, there weren't very many teenage boys who were really into that scenario. When I moved away from home and I went to university, my world really began to open up. I hung out with people who didn't look or act or think like me, and I shared some of my story with them. They shared their stories with me. And so I began to peel away my childhood skin and strip off the narrow ways of thinking that no longer made sense. And as I entered adulthood and left the religion of my childhood behind, I thought that I left the system of patriarchy behind as well. I was incredibly naive because even now, as a 40-mumble-year-old woman, I'm still learning all the ways in which these lessons of silence and submission are buried within me. When you are taught from a very young age, and those lessons are reinforced over and over again by everyone in your life, by the people that you love, they really become a part of who you are. So about a year ago, I was wrestling with a difficult situation in my career, and I was really anxious, couldn't sleep, kind of like a horned cucumber on a gate, if you're wondering what the hell that fruit is doing there. And at that time, another woman challenged me to stand up for myself and to use my voice in a new way, to be stronger and louder, even though I thought I already was strong and loud. Her exact words to me were, "You have more power than you know." And those words were like a stone dropped in a pond, and the ripples just kept spreading and spreading, and I began to see a really disturbing pattern in my life. I began to see all the ways in which I wait for someone in a position of power, usually a man, to give me permission. In spite of all my strength and skill and sass, I wait. Many times I do it without even realizing it. So your story is different than mine, but maybe you recognize some of these feelings. Because no matter where you grew up, no matter what your religion or lack thereof, no matter how free-spirited or repressed your childhood might have been, you have been told over and over again what is the acceptable standard of existing in society. So you might think, like I did, that you have successfully rebelled against an old way of thinking and being, only to discover that you're still subconsciously following the rules. Many of us, especially women, but really anyone who's ever been marginalized, anyone who doesn't look or sound or act like the people in power, we've been trained from a young age to sit quietly and raise our hands. Of course, there are a few of you sitting here today who are thinking, that's not me. I've never needed to ask for permission to do anything. I just say whatever I want when I want. So I see you, magical unicorns, and I would ask that you please don't tune out today because you might not need permission to speak. But you do need to realize that not everyone feels the same way that you do. Not everyone has the privilege and power that you enjoy. So, what I ask of you today is to hear the voices that are not like your own and to think of ways that you might, in your own life and work, make space for other people who are not like you so they can lift up their voices. Because for those of us who have been conditioned all our lives to take a seat, we find ourselves doubting our right to be heard, or we begin to believe that our voices don't matter. The idea of whose voice is acceptable is actually built right into the English language because you've got words like chairman, congressman, fireman, mankind, manpower, man-made lakes. Oh man, where did I leave my keys? And the one I'm most guilty of, you guys, no matter who is in the group. In an essay called Why Sexist Language Matters, sociology professor Cheryl Kleiman notes that linguists have a term called symbolic annihilation. It refers to the disappearance of women into male-based terms, meaning that by favoring terms like you guys, we make women a subset of men. Kleiman goes on to ask if we as women aren't worthy of true generics like first year instead of freshman, chair instead of chairman, or you all instead of you guys, then how can we expect to be paid a man's wage or be respected as people rather than objects? But on the other hand, if you're taught from birth that you are entitled to power and a platform just because of the body and the skin that you were born into, then you will act accordingly. You will believe that, of course, all of this was meant to be yours. Like believing you should run for president of the United States just because, man, I'm born to be in it. Which reminds me of this statistic. Men apply for a job when they meet only 60% of the qualifications, but women wait until they meet 100% to apply for a job. Another way of looking at how the system works. In 2018, the Harvard Business Review analyzed 81,000 performance reviews and studied the words used to describe men versus the words used to describe women. So men who received a negative performance review were penalized with just two adjectives, arrogant and irresponsible. But women were inept, selfish, frivolous, passive, scattered, opportunistic, gossipy, excitable, vain, panicky, temperamental, and indecisive. The way we use language to talk about women in our societies has a profound effect. Girls get the message from a very early age that our voices are not really welcome. And if we do speak up, we should prepare ourselves to get a little bit of feedback, to be called pushy, bossy, feisty, hysterical, difficult, shrill. I've been talking a lot right now about women because you might have noticed that I am one, but make no mistake, women are not the only ones who get the message that our voices are not welcome. If you look at any culture, there are the people who have the power and the people who don't, the people who do the squashing and the people who get squashed. And in every one of those societies, the voices that are the loudest and the most numerous are the voices of people in power, because your voice is your power. If you take away someone's voice or you convince them that their voice doesn't matter, so they just go ahead and silence themselves for you, then you make that person invisible. And if you make an entire group of people invisible, then you can do with them whatever you want. You can deny them civil rights, you can pay them less money for the same amount of work, you can discredit them, harass them, conquer them. History shows us the evidence of this over and over again. In 1975, cultural anthropologists Edwin and Shirley Ardner came up with the muted group theory. The whole idea is that the dominant group, the people with the power, are in charge of the vocabulary and a society's communication system, social norms, etc. So in order to speak up and be heard, the marginalized groups have to first learn to use the dominant group's system in order to express themselves. But it's difficult for them to articulate their ideas and their thoughts because they have to go through a translation process to try to make themselves understood. They don't have the power, so they're not as free to say what they want, which keeps them from having the power. Here's an example and a photo of my daughter and her two aunties at the San Francisco Dyke March a couple years ago. So in many societies, LGBTQ groups are considered marginalized, right? Straight people are the norm, we're dominant. And since straight people control the discourse, they can and have ignore anyone who's not like them. The message that heterosexuality is the acceptable standard and everything else is an aberration is a very powerful one. It's one that's locked people in closets for years and for lifetimes. It's the reason why in America, nearly 42% of non-binary youth have tried to kill themselves at least once. And it's the reason why all around the world, lesbians, gay men, bisexual, transgender, intersex, and queer people are harassed in the streets, beaten, imprisoned, and even killed simply for being who they are. So before they can even begin to fight for equality, LGBTQ people have to first fight to make their voices heard at all. Muted group theory applies also to issues of race, of aging, of disability, and you can see evidence of the silencing everywhere in our societies, in politics and education, and absolutely in the workplace. So there's all this talk today about diversity and inclusivity, and at Dropbox we even have this lofty mission to design a more enlightened way of working. So you might have thought we were just a blue and white tech company, but no, we're all about enlightenment and lots of different colors and fruits. If you could imagine a more enlightened way of working, wouldn't you think that opening the door to diverse perspectives would be a good way to start? It is. And in fact, decades of research by organizational scientists, psychologists, sociologists, economists, and demographers show that socially diverse groups are more innovative than homogeneous groups. That diversity enhances creativity and leads to better decision-making and better problem-solving, which is amazing. But simply tooting the horn for diversity is not enough when there are so many among us who do not feel entitled to raise their voices. We need to actually create the conditions for inclusivity and to listen to more than one voice and hear more than one story. This is Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and in a TED Talk called The Danger of the Single Story, she speaks about how she came to the US at age 19 to go to university, and her roommate, who was American, was shocked to discover that Chimamanda spoke English and knew how to use the stove and listen to Mariah Carey. And Chimamanda said that's because her roommate had been told one story of Africa. So she had an expectation for what a woman from Africa would be like, because she had only ever heard that it was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people, fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. We define our culture by the stories we tell each other. When we silence others, when we refuse to listen, then our stories become homogeneous and redundant. We don't consider new perspectives, only look at one small corner of the whole entire picture, and we all miss out. So just think for a moment about some of the stereotypes we hear all the time. All the homogeneous stories that just give one tiny corner of a version of truth, right? So women are bad drivers. Canadians apologize all the time. Irish people drink too much. Tech bros are ruining San Francisco, and people from Melbourne are coffee snobs, right? So then think of all the other stories about those stereotypes that we haven't heard when we narrow it down to just one note instead of the whole entire symphony. Think about the truth of human experience that is lost to us when we do that, the varied and complex voices that remain unheard. But what if you break that silence and add your voice to the melody? Because you can refuse to go quietly. You can lift up your voice and tell your story. But together, you're going to first need to be honest about who you are. You're going to need to do some serious introspection. And obviously, this is a perfect place for that. So I'm going to give you a quick guide that you can use to dig down and unearth your voice when you have a little more time and privacy. The first step in identifying your authentic voice is to ask yourself this question: who am I really? Because all of us, before we're writers or designers or whatever your answer is at parties when people ask, what do? We're human beings first. Humans with hurts and histories and loves and fears. We're full of passions and flaws and all kinds of things that we do not feature on our social media bios. But these imperfections that we instinctively try to hide, our failures, our mistakes, our weaknesses, our obsessions, those are actually the very things that connect us to other people. In fact, you might realize that those kinds of things are the very reasons that you love certain music or books or movies, not because they're perfect, but because they make you feel like you are less alone, like you're not the only oddity in the universe. So when I ask you to think about who you are, I'm not talking about a glossy facade carefully constructed to acknowledge the optics of what's most marketable right now. I'm asking you to be like Bowie, to do what you like. Your voice and your story and the thing you hold dear doesn't have to be the shiny thing that everybody else is talking about right now. It doesn't have to be the story that your family wants you to tell or the path your peers expect you to take. I'm asking you to listen to yourself with care and curiosity and compassion and figure out what's going on in there right now. And don't be afraid to get weird if weird is really your thing. Some of you already know what your thing is. You have a story burning a hole in your pocket, and you know how you want to use your voice. But some of you might not be so sure. And that's where a self audit might help. This involves some of that quiet introspection, and I'm going to ask you some questions in a couple of minutes that will help you build your own self audit. But to show you what I'm trying to get you to build, I'm going to show you my own. So, I'm a woman, I'm white, I'm straight, I'm American, I'm a Scorpio, I'm an introvert, I'm tall, I'm curvy, I'm a misanthrope. I'm a mother to a daughter, I'm married to a man, I'm a writer, I love to travel, I love to read, I love animals, I love to-do lists. I'm angry about the rise of white supremacy in my country, and I'm scared about all the fallout from climate change. I'm hopeful that we're not living in a horror show, and I want to use my voice to make a difference in the world. I also want to move to Canada, so if you're from Canada, you should talk to me later. I want to speak more than one language. I want to be more patient. I want to write more poems. So here's some questions to ask to get yourself there. What did you inherit? What are the things about yourself that you did not get to choose? Where you were born, who your family is, the gender you were assigned at birth. And then what did you choose for yourself? What are things that you made happen? Where you live, your art, your career. What brings you deep joy? What are your vices? What are you really good at? What makes you angry? What lights you up inside? What do you fear? What breaks your heart the most about this world? What lights a fire in your belly? What do you want to change? So what this self-audit is getting to is your values. Because not everything in this portrait that you build of yourself is of equal importance. For example, in mine, I said I was tall and curvy, which is true, but I don't feel the need to speak about that. There are others who that is their passion and platform, a model, Tess Holliday, Lizzo. But that's not for me. The things for me that stick out are outlined in neon in my head when I look at this list. They're things I care about deeply, but also things that I have experience in. So when I do speak about them, I have credibility. So remember, your voice is your power, and it's most powerful when you're honest. So not when you're saying what you think other people might want to hear. So get real and speak from the core of who you are about what is really in your heart of hearts. How do you know that this is yours? How do you know you're really getting real? How do you know that this voice is not your fears or your family or your friends? Well, it won't go away. You just can't get it out of your mind. It's something that you keep returning to over and over again. But it also feels right. You just feel in your bones that this is good and this is meant to happen. It makes sense. You can see yourself doing it, saying it, writing it, drawing it, wearing it, painting it, singing it, making it. It doesn't hurt in a bad way. It might hurt in a good way because you're going to have to do some work to get there. But if it's damaging or draining or demeaning, it is not you. Also, it lights you up. It gives you energy. You're passionate about it. When you talk about it to your friends, you're gesturing wildly. So you have this thing that you care about deeply. Then what is stopping you from using your voice to express yourself, to talk about it? This is going to require some more of that deep thoughts and honest inventory, but I have the confidence that you can handle it. So ask yourself, where in your life do you feel silenced? Where are you unable to express who you are and what you care about? When was the last time you really felt heard? When was the last time you wanted to say something, but you didn't? You silenced yourself. And what do you want to say that you're not saying? It's right there. You can feel it, but you just keep swallowing it down. Maybe you're worried that someone else has said it better than you, and so there's no need for you to speak. When I was writing this talk last year, there was another woman at Dropbox who gave a talk about women in tech using their voices. And my very first thought when I heard her speak was not, oh, great, good for her. It was, shit, she's talking about this. I guess I better just stop what I'm doing. Which is why I really love this quote. We're so lucky that flowers don't hold themselves back because other flowers are already blooming. This writer also said, someone else is already talking about it is a killer. It only serves to deny the world the beauty of your voice. Because it's true, someone else will always be doing it and be doing it beautifully, but that doesn't diminish the value of your own story. So maybe you take this inventory, you do this self-audit, you think about your values and what you care about, and you feel like you've been telling yourself and others the same story for a really long time, but it's not accurate anymore. You want to evolve and tell a different story. You can do that. And spoiler alert, you're going to have to do that over and over again because who you are at age 22 is not who you are at 32 or 42 or older. Your identity is not carved in stone. Living, if you're doing it right, will change you. You're going to travel to foreign lands and meet new people and read powerful words, and these things will change you. You're going to love people and lose people and hurt people and be hurt by people, and these things will change you. Parenthood will change you. Getting older will change you. So you'll have to recalibrate from time to time and open yourself up and ask again, who am I now? And what's going on inside of me here? And how does that change how I'm expressing myself or my values to the world? But also, this does not mean you have to tear your bleeding heart out and hold it up for the world to see, because that's really exhausting. It could just be that you want to pivot in your art and add or show something that's more raw or real in you and less calculated marketing strategy. So I follow this artist on Instagram, Lisa Falzon, for years, and she used to post a lot of art like this. But then last year, she decided she wanted to make a change. And so she wrote this post to her followers. After some soul searching, I realized I no longer want to solely curate and create my old brand anymore. From now on, this account will have the range and scope of artistic mischief I get up to, not the one-trick pony shit I've been making myself out to be just so the algorithm won't punish me. The relief I feel for not having to pretend in my 30s to be a person I barely was in my late 20s is real. So maybe that's what this is about for you too. Because your voice isn't just your voice. It's not just words. It's your character, your personality, and expression of who you are and what you care about. It's the stuff you make, words or music or visual or performance. It's how you carry yourself. It's even what you wear. So what I'm asking you to do today to find and own your true voice is absolutely hard and uncomfortable. It can incur real physical and emotional risk for some people, and I don't want to diminish that. For some, this is a lot more difficult and scary than for others. So maybe you've let that fear silence you. It would be completely understandable. The fear of how people might respond to you or how they won't, the fear of what happens next, the fear of making yourself vulnerable. The question that you have to ask yourself then is, what is more oppressive, the fear or the silence? For me, there is no one in current culture who represents speaking up in the face of fear more than this woman. Her name is Chanel Miller, but you might know her better as Emily Doe, a woman raped in the dark behind a dumpster at Stanford University a few years ago. She is so much more than a survivor of assault. She is a blinding light. The world first heard her voice when her victim impact statement was published on BuzzFeed in 2016, and to date, more than 11 million people have read it. But she recently stepped out from the safety of her anonymity as Emily Doe and published a memoir called Know My Name. And I really love what she says about her voice in this book. She says, Brock Turner will always be the swimmer turned rapist. He was great, and then he fell. Anything I do in the future will be by the victim who wrote a book. His talent precedes the tragedy. I was supposedly born in it. I did not come into existence when he harmed me. She found her voice, people say. I had a voice. He stripped it, left me groping around blind for a bit, but I always had it. I just used it like I never had to use it before. I do not owe him my success, my becoming. He did not create me. You will find society asking you for the happy ending, saying, come back when you're better, when what you say can make us feel good, when you have something more uplifting or affirming. This ugliness was something I never asked for. It was dropped on me, and for a long time I worried that it made me ugly too. It made me into a sad, unwelcome story that nobody wanted to hear. But when I wrote the ugly and painful parts into a statement, an incredible thing happened. The world did not plug up its ears. It opened itself to me. So I take a lot of heart and inspiration from Chanel's words because I know what it feels like to believe your story is unwelcome, and I think a lot of you do as well. So please hear me on this. Your truth is valid no matter what happens next, no matter how your voice might falter, no matter how many tone police or gaslighters show up in the comment section. Your story is yours to tell whenever you're ready to share it. I'm standing up here because there is no one else in this room who can say the things that I have to say, just like there's no one else in this room or in this city or in this world even who can share the stories that you have to tell. Your voice is yours. You don't need permission to be who you are. The only person who has to give you permission to share your story is you. So don't silence yourself. Don't let your voice be one of the lost ones, because there is someone out there who needs to hear the story that lives inside of you. If you're brave enough to use your voice, you can give someone else the courage to find their own. You can inspire someone or awaken someone or make them just uncomfortable enough that they begin to question their own fears and prejudices. Your story can change the world. Maybe that sounds like a delusion of grandeur, like I'm shining you on. But let me tell you one more story about how that happens. So at the beginning of this talk, I alluded to the fact that I've parted ways with the religion that I was born into. And sidebar here, if you have a religion or faith practice that's meaningful to you, I'm absolutely not advocating that you run screaming away from it. This was just part of my story, and it was a journey that took many years. But I can point to one single conversation, one small seed of a story that changed me forever. I was 21 years old, and I was writing for a newspaper in Indianapolis, Indiana, as part of a postgraduate journalism fellowship. And it was the mid-90s, and AIDS was a really hot topic then. So I was assigned to write a story about an AIDS patient named Jay Sprinkle. Jay was a gay man, and when I met him, he was in the hospital. But I actually never really met him because I was afraid to get AIDS on me, because I had been told a single story about men like Jay Sprinkle. So I just talked to him on the phone once for 20 minutes. And during that conversation, he told me a story, his story, of growing up gay in rural conservative America at a time when being gay was not okay. He had been living in Indianapolis for a few years, and one weekend he returned home to the small town he grew up in. It was a Sunday morning, and so he stopped by his old church. The service had already started, so he just quietly slipped in the back and sat in a pew. The people in front of him turned around to see who had come in. They knew him. He had grown up there, but they turned back around without saying anything to him and began whispering to each other, and he heard the word faggot. So Jay stood back up, quietly walked out, and never entered another church again. It was a really painful story for him to tell. I could hear the hurt and the sorrow in his voice over the line, and he didn't have to share it. He didn't know me. I wasn't going to use it for my newspaper story. But because he let me in and he was brave enough to show me this raw part of himself, I suddenly saw the world different than I had before that conversation. I began to see the cracks in my own worldview. I began to see that this man was not the abomination that I had been taught for years that he was. In hearing a story different from the one I had heard all my life, I saw possibilities in which my way of thinking might be wrong, that the world might be bigger and more mysterious and more beautiful than I had realized. By telling me his story, Jay broke me wide open, and I was never the same again. Your story and your voice have more power than you know. So use it. Give yourself permission to speak. Thank you so much.
I